Alright guys, we're back in my garage, and today we're going to be talking about B58 low pressure fuel pump upgrades. And this is kind of in response to a lot of you guys that reached out to me after some of my previous videos. You were wondering if a fuel pump upgrade was needed for your specific setup, and kind of just why a lot of us don't talk about it. And there's no real secret there, there's a good reason for that. So we'll talk about the limits of our low pressure fuel pump so that you know when one would be needed for your build, and also what you should pay attention to when looking at the different options on the market so you can pick the right one for your goals. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. So the main reason why a lot of us don't talk about low pressure fuel pump upgrades is because majority of us don't need it. Our low pressure fuel pump is extremely capable from the factory, so it's not like previous platforms that you might be from that require a low pressure fuel pump to push higher levels of ethanol or run higher horsepower with a big turbo. In our case, our stock low pressure fuel pump has been proven to support 650 to 700 wheel horsepower pretty reliably. So it's something, again, that majority of people don't need because most people don't shoot for that much power. Now, I know a lot of people don't really dyno their cars, so it's kind of hard to know when you're at that horsepower range and you don't really have that frame of reference. Keep in mind, most tuners will know when one would be needed, so talk to your tuner and they can give you pretty good guidance on that. But if you're trying to figure it out yourself, usually you're going to need port injection before you need a low pressure fuel pump upgrade. So on a Gen 1 B58, you'll max out your direct injection setup even with, a Deutsch Stage 2, and then you'll add port injection, and a low pressure fuel pump upgrade will pretty much be right around the corner for you. If you have a TU engine or you have a TU high pressure fuel pump and you're pairing that with port injection, usually you can get another 100 wheel horsepower or so. That usually translates to around 5 to 6 PSI on most turbos before a low pressure fuel pump upgrade again will be needed. So just to kind of gauge it, if you have port injection and you're running upwards of 29 to 30 plus PSI, that's usually when people start hitting the limits. One thing to consider is that the low pressure fuel pump is highly dependent on your platform. So even though all of the fuel pumps from different generations of B58s and different models flow the same amount and have the same limits, they have slightly different basket designs. So if you have an F series like 340i, you can't use the fuel pump from a 540i because it's a G series and they're just slightly different. And the same thing for the Supra, it's completely different because it actually mounts from the bottom of the fuel tank instead of underneath the rear seat like most cars. So if you're looking at upgrades or looking at buying one used, just make sure that you know what platform it's designed for and that it matches your car so that everything will fit properly. Also, it's really critical to make sure that you don't mess with how the stock low pressure fuel pump is controlled. The controller is fine-tuned to make sure it's delivering an optimized amount of fuel to the engine. So it looks at what the demand is based on, if you're just driving around town or if you're flooring it, and it adjusts how much fuel is being sent to the engine based on that feedback. So it's all controlled by the DME. Now, what that means is you can't put any old conventional pump in its place because conventional pumps either run at 100% or they're off. And if you just plug that into the stock location, it's going to send way too much fuel as soon as you turn on the car because it's not going to be calibrated appropriately with the DME. So aftermarket companies have a couple different ways that they found to work around this. The first one, and the one that I probably like the most, is finding an aftermarket pump that is plug and play with the stock pump. And the main company that makes one of these is from Performance Fueling Solutions. They basically identified another brushless fuel pump that can install in the exact same stock location, and it will run with the OEM calibration, but it can just flow a lot more fuel when you're running full throttle. And this is kind of difficult to do because you have to find a pump that works under other scenarios as well. Of course, under full throttle, most pumps will deliver as much fuel as you need, but you also want to make sure that you find one that works when you're driving around town at partial throttle and things like that. Now, the biggest bottleneck here is that you're probably not going to be able to find a pump that can be controlled by the DME and adjust for the new pump that can actually flow way more fuel than the stock one can flow. So like I said, our stock one can flow up to 700 wheel horsepower. The PFS one can flow up to around 800 wheel horsepower with higher ethanol mixes. So that's just kind of a limitation. Again, most people aren't going to need to go much past that. So I still think it's a very viable upgrade, and it's really nice that it's 100% plug and play. But if you're shooting for more than that, then you're going to have to look at different options. Now, the next step up from there is running a dual pump setup. And so what that means is that you leave the OEM pump alone and you add a secondary pump that is just a regular conventional pump. Now again, with these conventional pumps, they're going to run at 100% as soon as they see power. So what you're going to need to do is make sure you have something controlling that fuel pump so that it only turns on when it's actually needed. Now, because you're going to be doing this after you already have port injection, a lot of people like to use this with their port injection controller. So a motive reflex can actually use some of its outputs to turn on and off a low pressure fuel pump from the motive reflex tune. So that's something that gives you a lot of control to make sure that it's only turning on when it's needed. Now, if you don't have a reflex or you just simply don't want to do it that way, you can also use what they call a Hobbs switch. And this switch is really handy, it's pretty cheap, and it's just kind of like a manual boost controller. In this case, it's a manual control for connection. So you're going to have the wires come in on both sides, and then in the middle, this switch is going to be screwed into your charge pipe or your intake manifold. And when it sees boost, it's going to make the connection, and then the fuel pump will actually see power. So this is a nice kind of cheap solution to make sure that the fuel pump only turns on at a certain boost level. It's manually adjustable. Underneath this cap, you can actually turn the little Allen, and that will adjust whether you want more boost or less boost to actually turn on the trigger. But because there's no way to see how much boost it's set at, it's not really, the smartest controller or the easiest way to set it to a specific boost level, but it works. These are really reliable, so a lot of people just like going this route. Now, the dual fuel pump setups come in a couple different styles. Some people like to put it inside of the basket, which is really nice because it gets all of the regular benefits that the stock pump gets as well. It's always submerged in fuel and helps limit fuel starvation, as well as optimize heat even when you're low on fuel. However, the biggest drawback here is you can only fit a certain size fuel pump in the basket, and a higher flowing pump is going to be physically larger. So eventually you kind of hit the limits there. Others are using an external carrier that kind of clamps onto the basket, and then the secondary pump hangs outside of it. Again, this gives you a lot more room to run a larger fuel pump. So depending on your horsepower needs, this can definitely put you in that ballpark. But again, being outside of the basket, there are some limitations and things that you want to consider. You don't want to run below a quarter tank of fuel with fuel pumps like these, and you definitely want to probably keep it above a half tank if you're going to be going around a track with high-speed turns and stuff, just to prevent yourself from starving of fuel. Now, I know sometimes when the pump is in the basket, some people can't tell if it's a dual pump setup. Another thing that you can do is look on top of the hat itself, and you'll see the two extra connections for where you're supposed to send power and ground for the secondary pump. So if you see those small screws and nuts on top of the pump hat and you can't see an external pump hanging outside of the basket, that just indicates that there's still a secondary pump. It's just in the basket itself. Now, there are a couple outliers that I do just want to give an honorable mention. So the first one is from Precision Raceworks and their Stage 4.5 kit. Their highest rated kit comes with a really large external pump outside of the basket, and then it completely deletes the OEM fuel filter and the kind of regulator setup that's built into the basket for external units. And by doing this, they can also increase the size of the fuel lines, and this helps eliminate any potential bottlenecks that you might see, especially for people shooting for 1,000+ horsepower. You just don't really want to have to think about something like fuel lines holding you back. So completely replacing all of those is really nice. And as far as I'm aware, nobody has hit the limits of that setup yet. Another one that I like is the Titan Motorsports fuel system. And again, this one is just completely different from the others, primarily because it has a surge tank. So you can see in the pictures, they use a radium kind of bottle-shaped surge tank, and then you have an extra fuel pump in there. And then you're also going to add an extra fuel pump in the fuel tank. So your stock fuel pump is going to run just like normal. It's going to continue to supply your direct injection fuel system. And then you have this additional pump that runs to the surge tank. And whenever your car sees high demand and you're going into high boost, then the secondary pump will turn on and pull fuel from that surge tank, and it can give you fuel hopefully for, the 10 seconds or so that you need it, whether you're doing a roll race, drag race, or going, through a road course. Now, this is really nice because the radium surge tank design really fits the fuel pump design well and helps eliminate starvation, even though you have an external fuel pump. So now you're not only supporting high horsepower setups, but you're giving added safety to people that are going around road courses. And a perfect example of this is the fuel system that Jackie Ding runs on his A90 Supra, and he's got several track records across the country. So he's proven that that system is really reliable, and when you're worried about running as little weight in your car as possible, being able to run low on fuel and still have that secondary surge tank to support your fuel system in high-speed turns or anytime you run into fuel starvation issues is really nice to have. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything. Again, it's not really a secret. It's just not something that most people need. And unfortunately, that means that there aren't as many write-ups and technical discussions going on about it because it's just not something that most people are looking into. So these are just kind of the basics to help get you guys going. As always, you can reach out to the individual companies or your tuner if you have any specific questions about what would work best for your setup. But there are definitely a lot of options out there, and I'm sure more will be coming in the future. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.